It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. In the 80s, there was a thing called satanic panic that was running rampant across the United States and other countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, and a few others. But there were a few ways in which this would kind of bubble up across pop culture. Most of this came from conservative and especially religious spaces, as these groups would often attack everything from toys for kids, cereal for kids, cartoons for kids, Dungeons and Dragons, or anything like a game or something that dealt with magic or fantasy, mostly for kids, video games, mostly for kids, pretty much any horror movie, and rock and roll, particularly any music that featured suggestive lyrics or a hard rock style. And what's kind of funny is that you probably noticed two things. The first thing is pretty obvious. They like to attack things that were mostly enjoyed by kids. And then those last two things were mostly enjoyed by young adults. And these were adults that were often deemed outsiders. So two of those areas that were usually focused on by these busybody groups that sure seem to care way too much about what other people did with their lives, that's going to be at the very heart of this week's movie that I'm going to talk about. In 1988's Black Roses, we'll see rock and roll and horror at play. And on top of that, there will also be a little bit of a parody of these overly protective, culturally conservative types included as well. That parody of the religious busybody is played by horror movie royalty Julie Adams, who was the original crush of the creature from the Black Lagoon. Black Roses was directed by John Fasano. Now, Fasano only directed a few movies in his career, but in 1987, he made two other rock and roll themed horror movies. Both of these starred the Canadian bodybuilding heavy metal actor superstar John Michael Thor, who professionally was just known as Thor. These kind of infamous movies starring Thor were Zombie Nightmare and Rock and Roll Nightmare. Those are a couple of fairly bizarre and trippy flicks that you almost have to see to believe. But beyond directing a handful of movies, Fasano worked on movies in other ways. He wrote films like Another 48 Hours, starring Eddie Murphy and Nick Nolte, 1999's Universal Soldier: The Return, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, and then also he worked on a version of The Hunchback that came out in 1997 that starred Mandy Patinkin, Richard Harris, and Salma Hayek. Then, on top of all of that, he also served as a producer on films like 1993's Tombstone. The guy's got movies of, that are all over the range of quality and budget size on his filmography. But of the 6 films he directed, I will go ahead and say that I probably would think that Black Roses is easily his best. So, let's unpack it, shall we? The movie starts with a band performing to a sold-out venue. Now, this rock band is made up of entirely guys with monster faces and monster hands. In fact, I'm pretty sure they're just monsters. But when a guy comes in to close down the event with cops, he opens the door to the auditorium and outpours a whole bunch of other monsters. Monsters created out of the audience listening to the band. We then go to the sleepy town Mill Basin, where 2 Lamborghinis pull up full of a bunch of rockin' hair metal guys and girls. As the town wakes up for their typical day, the band is putting up signs declaring that there will be a show by Black Roses in Mill Basin. Now, Black Roses mostly features the hunky Damien as the lead singer, and aside from Damien and Black Roses, there are 3 key characters that we will meet that really kind of two of them play throughout the movie, and one of them's a little bit more important in the early stages of the movie. The first person we meet is Matthew Morehouse, the lit teacher at the local high school. Then there is Johnny, who is a smart-ass rebel. He's the one who's a little bit more important in the first half of the movie than he really is in the later part of the movie. But the other key figure across the entirety of the movie is Julie, the star student who listens to Mr. Morehouse's class and teachings quite intently. And while Julie seems smitten by Morehouse, Johnny is definitely smitten by Julie. So the adults are pretty miffed about Black Roses coming to town to play for 3 shows. They see the band as a corrupting influence, especially among the younger generation in town. Mrs. Miller, the one played by Julie Adams, is the one leading the charge in the town to kick Black Roses out. After all, they have subversive lyrics that she reads off to members of the town and the city's council. Clearly, they will rot the kids' brains. And why won't anyone think of the children, right? You know, I mean, Mrs. Miller is really going out on a limb here, sticking up for these kids. But anyway, Mayor Farnsworth agrees that the band stuff is a little antisocial. But, I mean, he's no stick in the mud. I mean, he says that the nature of rock and roll is just that, to be, you know, kind of rebellious and antisocial. It gives kids something to, you know, kind of react to. And what's the difference between this band and people like the Beatles or Chuck Berry or Elvis? Now, Julie does agree to go out with Johnny that night, and Johnny is full of a lot of emotions. In fact, he is way over the top. I would think that there are equal chances that his rebellious nature will push Julie away, as well as potentially make her like him even more. I don't know. But he's disaffected. He's rebellious. He's full of hormones. We'll just say hormones. He's brash and desperate to either get out of town or be something more than what he figures his father is likely going to pass down to him, which is being a barber. And that's why he's specifically excited about the Black Roses coming to town. He's young. He wants to get out there and paint the town red. In fact, he even breaks into a hardware store to get some red paint to paint the town red before he's forced to abandon that when Mr. Morehouse comes along. But anyway, he's full of energy that he needs to somehow express in some way. But at the first show, the mayor, the school board, other members of town, and Mrs. Miller attend to get an idea of what this band is all about. And to their surprise, they see a fairly well-groomed, even with the gigantic teased long hair, and, you know, this very good-looking band comes out on stage, seems to be very nice and respectful, and they open with a much softer pop song about Damien's hometown and how much he really likes and digs that old town. So Mayor Farnsworth sees nothing wrong with the band whatsoever, and Mrs. Miller, despite saying that the band is still loud, agrees. They don't seem to be all that harmful. The rest of the adults leave the concert. And the moment they do, Black Roses changes their tune and the place begins to rock out, and the real style of the band and Damien begins to show through. The next morning, the kids are completely uninterested in class. In fact, they even dress and style their hair and makeup differently. Even Julie has lost interest in Mr. Morehouse's lessons. Morehouse is surprised when Julie says that the band gave all their quote-unquote fans free tickets to all their shows. And Morehouse goes to speak to Damien and is surprised to learn that a few things. Number one, this is really kind of their first exposure on stage. Well, Damien corrects himself and says that they did have a show before that did not go over the way they expected. But one thing that Morehouse is specifically surprised by is that Damien, this guy from out of town who is worlds apart from the people of Mill Basin, well, he knows that Morehouse dates the mayor's daughter, Priscilla, or at least used to. And Damien says Morehouse is famous. It's like he knows his soul. But Black Rose's records start making their way to the kids, and they just basically want to sit around and listen to them all the time. When one of the kids' dads disapproves of his son's earring and the taste in his music, the Black Rose's record causes a demon monster to crawl out of the speaker on the wall and eat the father's face before pulling him into the speaker. At the next concert, all the kids begin chanting for Damien to take the stage, and during the show, the music from Black Roses turns some of the kids into corpses and skeletons and stuff. But after the show, the kids start treating their parents in peculiar ways. One kid brings her friend over to sexually tease her father until he dies from a heart attack. Another kills his mother after she nags him about going to the concert. Johnny is first visited by a woman in his room who may or may not be a monster, totally has sex with him, and then decides that he needs to kill his father with a gun that he just happens to have in his sock drawer. The next day at school, Morehouse's class gets out of control when they would rather talk about Damien than transcendentalism. Quite frankly, I would rather talk about Damien than transcendentalism in terms of Ralph Waldo Emerson. But anyway, after learning that people are now dead, Morehouse tries to get the help from the mayor, but the mayor is kind of a loser. He just thinks this guy is starting to sound a little too concerned for the kids. He would rather Morehouse come over and take his daughter out for a date and get back together with her than do anything about this Black Roses business. Somehow, Morehouse guesses correctly that there is witchcraft and black magic afoot, and this band with this band at least, and how it's taken over the minds of the kids. So after not getting any attention from her teacher, Julie goes home and brains her stepdad and follows that up by killing Mr. Morehouse's old flame Priscilla, who, I mean, honestly, Morehouse was not impressed with Priscilla kind of talking down about his career as a teacher, and he was on the outs with her anyway. But when Morehouse comes home, he's told by the mayor that Priscilla died in a car fire, which only proves to him that there is more devil business going on. And then Julie comes over to try to seduce Morehouse, and he rejects her, so she turns into a demon monster, and he has to end up killing that demon monster, so he believes he's killed Julie. Now, Morehouse goes to the Black Roses concert with the plan to burn the place down with Damien trapped inside. Damien says that all these kids belong to him now, and when he's held captive by some of the kids and members of the band, Morehouse sees Damien transform into a monster, and even the people holding him captive are transformed into monsters as well. Morehouse fights Damien as a monster for a bit before lighting the place on fire and escaping. The kids also escape with the help of the fire department and the mayor, and the kids are kind of brought out of the auditorium shocked and confused. They are all now freed from Damien's control, but don't realize that they've killed their own parents, which is kind of dark if you really think about it. But later, Morehouse and Mayor Farnsworth learn of a record-breaking sold-out show at Madison Square Garden for Black Roses and their controversial frontman, Damien, before the band planned to take their show overseas to England for a full-on tour. So let's talk about 3 things I like about Black Roses. First, I kind of love how stark the differences between the parents and the kids are in terms of points of view, and most definitely their music taste. There are only 2 kinds of styles: hair metal and stuffy-ass classical shit. The parents have hardly anything in common as far as common ground to reach with the kids. While the Beatles and Elvis are mentioned, the parents just kind of shrug it off by saying, yeah, I guess they're right about music. But there is no reference to any other rock and roll made by the parents. There's no intention of them listening to anything that they would have gotten into, except for Morehouse putting on a classical album at one point. There's just no other reference made other than just hating on Black Roses, and the kids find them to be cool. If any adult references music, it's some sort of lame style. It's so stupid and quaint and stark that you almost just have to love it, because this movie has zero interest in doing anything but just having a band led by, I guess, a demon or the devil himself, I'm not entirely sure, turning kids into evil brats. I mean, it's kind of exploitation in its most raw form. Second, there is a surprising angle this movie takes with its characters. None of them are particularly likable. Now, I'm a guy who needs to like the characters in the movie I'm going to spend anywhere from 75 to 120 minutes watching. I've been known to come down pretty hard on movies for not having any likable characters in it. I mean, yet, in Black Roses, I think the characters being dysfunctional and kind of unlikable helps the movie. The kids are all kind of bratty, except for Julie, at least at first. Now, I'll come back around to that because I've got a lot of questions about Julie here. But Morehouse is kind of okay, but it does seem like he takes his job a little too seriously. He's a little too... He asks a lot of his students for just being a high school English lit teacher. He's kind of the... I think he's a little too suspicious immediately about this rock band, even though he doesn't really want to be a stick in the mud. He's too quick to guess what's going on there. I mean, he just kind of thinks that all these kids need is Ralph Waldo Emerson and everything will be just fine. But the movie opens in an interesting way. The families of Mill Basin are all, I don't know, kind of normal in a dysfunctional way. The parents struggle to get the kids out of bed for school. The kids have beef with their parents for various reasons. Some are tough on the kids. Some have some of the kids have lecherous stepdads. Some of the kids feel trapped by being in this small town and their parents not really having a worldly view of anything outside of Mill Basin. It's kind of realistic in that way. It's not terribly shocking that the first opportunity to feel like they belong brings the kids to the feet of Damien. I get it. But maybe the biggest surprise is that really the kids don't seem to be spared by any of this. At the start of this movie, you might think that Johnny and Julie would start to maybe fall under the control of Damien, but realize it's not right and they break free, or they always see something wrong with the band and with the kids and they try to save the kids. But no, I mean, Johnny goes evil immediately and kills his father, and Julie, while being scorned by not getting the attention from Morehouse that she wants, she kills the mayor's daughter and attacks Morehouse by turning into a demon. I mean, the good girl is not really spared in this movie, sort of. Again, I'll come back around to that. But in a sort of a way, I almost feel like this movie was consistently rewritten or reshot along the way. More on that in a minute. I wouldn't be surprised if Johnny and Julie were meant to be the good guys in the end, but it got changed because it would just be different and, cool to have there be no good guys, or no good girls saved from the evil influence of Damien. But I also think that it might have just been thought of as just scary enough to think that this band really is this evil. And yeah, the town's kids are maybe unsalvageable, or at least so we think. Again, I'm going to come back around to that before I close out this episode, because I do think there is something very confusing at the end here. But third, I do like the creature effects in this movie quite a bit. Sure, this is a low budget movie, and you can tell that extends to the effects at times as well, but these are all practical monsters. The effects artists were Richard Platt and Michael Maddy, and they came recommended by Dick Smith, a massive name in effects makeup, thanks to his work on The Exorcist. Now, the small budget and tight schedule were tough on the effects artist, but the work that they did was pretty good. The monster that came out of the speaker was pretty good. The audience members turning into monsters or skeletons or whatever, the makeup for Damien in the opening scene, all of that was just great. And of course, what Damien turns into at the end is really good too. It's a really cool rubber suit monster and all that jazz. But, Julie's transformation into a demon monster was done quite well. And the creature, while sort of silly looking, is pretty good, if it's not really scary regardless. But this movie might not be much more than an obscure cult classic, but I will say that the monsters do look good in it. All right, so let's go back to that thing I kept saying in the second like that we'll come back around to. I said the kids were unsalvageable. That's not totally true. What does seem to be totally true is that the movie was either rewritten in the process of making the movie or was reshot somewhere along the way to kind of change something that happens in the movie or change the ending. Not only are the kids, some of which are turned into monsters, but they seemingly all got saved by Morehouse battling Damien for their souls. I think that's what we're supposed to believe. It sounds good. Anyway, not only that, but when Morehouse confronts Damien directly, right there on the stage, on the bad guy's arm, hanging on his every word, is Julie. But I thought Julie was killed in the scene prior to that, right? I don't know. Because she is there, and Morehouse most definitely saves her personally by specifically picking her up and walking her out of the auditorium when he sets the place on fire. I mean, in fact, when Damien is turning into his monster form, she seems already freed from her trance and is scared of Damien and what he's turning into. It takes a little more convincing for the other kids to break free, but yeah, I mean, I do think this movie was the kind of production that was just like, we're winging it here. And, they had the idea that Julie could be saved. And maybe that was the original idea, but somewhere along the way, they also liked the idea of adding some extra spice by having her, trying to seduce Morehouse and ended up turning into a monster out of it. Whatever it is that ends up having Julie both turned into a monster and killed by Morehouse and then later saved by Morehouse battling Damien, it doesn't change the fact that I enjoy watching Black Roses, even if there is that really confusing thing by having a character we just saw turn into a monster and die, show up at the end and get saved. Whatever it is, the three things I pointed out, all of those things I do like about this movie. I do enjoy watching this movie, even if I get quite confused by the end, and I'm not entirely sure if some of these people are saved, not saved, know what they were doing when they were under the control of Damien, whatever. It's still a fun movie. I have a good time watching it. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, Monster Mondays hits the big 300, and for this big 300th episode, I felt it only appropriate to discuss the movie that brought the Big G his historic Oscar victory. Oh yeah, it's Godzilla -1. Until next week, stay spooky.